Hello, I'm Sarah Crossan and I'm the author of Breathe and its sequel, Resist. I came up with the idea for Breathe when I took a trip to Washington State Park in the US. It's on the West Coast and whole mountainsides were logged of trees, and I was disappointed and upset that all these trees were being logged. And recently I took a trip to New Zealand and the same thing was happening there, which really surprised me. I don't think of New Zealand as that kind of place, but I think it's just happening everywhere. And I took it to its extreme and said, well, what if there were no trees at all? What if we had to cut them all down for agriculture, for cattle grazing? And so Breathe is a world that I imagined as a result of this. And Breathe is a world where there are no trees, the runoff from agriculture has killed the seas and there's no oxygen on the planet. So the only option was to build these pods and pump in artificial air. And only a few people were given places in these pods. They were too small to house everyone, and everyone else died. And so Breathe kind of picks up in the future where we are in the pod with these few survivors, a few thousand survivors. And they don't know things that perhaps would help them, that they're in a pod where there's an ultimate power who has control over the air they breathe and therefore all the decisions that they make. And it's a scary world, and they can leave the pod, but if they do, they have to bring air with them, and the elements are very scary and frightening. Outside the pod is frightening, but inside the pod is frightening as well. So a secret about Resist is that there is another narrative voice. So Breathe is told in 3 voices and Resist is told in 4 voices, which was very difficult to do, but this person had to speak. So that's a new thing that we've got in this new novel. I always think of Breathe and Resist as books. I don't think of them as films, but if they were to become films, I think that my main priority would be that it was set in London, because that's where I imagine the world. And I don't know who would play Bee, Quinn and Alina, but I think that David Morrissey would be a good pod minister. And Harry Styles from One Direction has the look of Quinn, but I don't know whether he's any good at acting, so he'd have to be given some kind of casting audition to make sure he could play the role properly. I have lots and lots of favourite dystopian novels. I think the first one would be 1984, ORWELL, because it's just a classic. I think it's what probably most dystopian novels are based on in some way, this idea of ultimate control from some authority, some government, and lies being told. I also love Malorie Blackman's Noughts and Crosses, because I think it was a really original idea, where it's a world where white people are subject to racism. I thought that was a really original idea, and I used to teach that book, and kids love that book. I love Never Let Me Go by KAZUO ISHIGURO, a world where really, I think that world is really just about how we're all destined to die in a way, and which is, I think, one of the things that dystopia looks at is kind of our own mortality and where we fit into the world. I also love The Giver, another classic young adult dystopia. I think it's particularly popular in the US, and I like the way that is a very kind of quiet book for young adults. There are no explosions or anything like that. It's a very, very quiet novel, and about really deeply about character, and ends very quietly and with a question, which I like.